Welcome to Macro Minds, where I talk to economists and other experts about the issues of our time. Claudia, thank you for joining me. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to kick off your series. This is great.
No, it's a real pleasure for me. You may be the most in-demand economist on the street at the moment, given we're all watching carefully at your indicator. So much about that for now. I think maybe actually I can just start with an observation from this side of the Atlantic when I'm thinking about the U.S. economy, and then maybe you tell me what you think about that, and then we can get into a few questions. I find this is a difficult economy to get a handle on. We've had a series of shocks, many of them structural, to both demand and supply. Not all negative shocks, I might add, and we're uncertain about just fundamental issues. What's the natural rate of unemployment? Where's potential growth in the US? What's the neutral rate? There's not much synchronicity across economies, so it's very difficult to compare like for like. And then within the US, you have contradictions across indicators. So that's the puzzle I'm trying to unlock. Perhaps you tell me what you think about that.
Right. It is absolutely the case that the economy in the US, in the UK, other countries, there's some real challenges in reading it, particularly if you want to rely on historical experiences, right? It can make it very difficult to parse. What we need to do is keep it in the context of the last 4.5 years. So the global pandemic and then a war in Ukraine had effects that, while there are differences in the details, I think it is remarkable, particularly early in this episode, how similar some of the challenges were that were being faced. You had supply chains breaking down, you had labor shortages, we've had higher inflation, commodity inflation. So things we were in this together. This was a global cycle, and it was kicked off by a pandemic. This is not your typical kind of business cycle that has an economic undercurrent to it. And yet we also have had some business cycle aspects to this, a deep recession, a fast recovery. So the challenge, right, I think continues to be remembering the context of the past 4.5 years. Right, there have been echoes of COVID. There have been echoes of, I think particularly labor markets took quite a while to get back online, and then also we need to not miss the signs of, yes, there were much higher interest rates, and we really have slowed things down, and that kind of parsing out, what direction are we really pointed in right now? And it does differ some across countries. The U.S. has had more of a buffer. I mean, the growth rates in the U.S. still look really good. We've had some really good productivity numbers, but there are patterns, there are kind of directions that look pretty similar, both in the economies and also policy decisions across several countries.
Well, when I compare the US to most European economies, particularly the UK is a great example of an economy that since 2021 has had US demand growth, if I look at a broad measure of aggregate demand like nominal GDP, but European supply shocks. And the result has been much more inflation. But what strikes me is, and you mentioned the pandemic, is before the pandemic, economies looked quite sleepy. The lockdowns, the big stimulus seemed to store a lot of economic energy that was released all of a sudden. And then since the pandemic, we've had consistent surprises to the upside, whether that's just outsized growth in the US relative to estimates, or actually things not turning out quite so bad as expected in Europe. We've not had much growth, but in contrast to the recessions expected after the gas shock in 2022, things have turned out much better. Where do you think the US labor market is at the moment? And I'm sort of teeing you up here for just a discussion around the Sahm indicator. Perhaps you can just explain to us what that is, why it's useful, and why this time perhaps things might be a little different.
Okay, so also big picture, the labor market in the United States looks to still be in a pretty good place, but it's headed in the wrong direction. It's slowing, and it has slowed more now than seems to be necessary to get inflation under control. Right. So that's kind of big picture where I see the labor market. And I think largely that's how the Fed is describing the labor market and kind of basing their decisions. Now, the Sahm Rule, so this recession indicator, which I developed in 2019, and it was looking at the historical record right? So it turned on in the global pandemic, but I think anything would have noticed we were in a recession. But it's based on changes in the unemployment rate. So it goes back when I said there, the U.S. labor market is pointing in the wrong direction. That is what the Sahm Rule really triggers off on. We have gone into a recession in the United States at all different levels of unemployment. Having a 3.5% unemployment rate actually does not mean there's no chance of a recession. I mean, this is not very frequent historically, but so looking at, we look changes in the unemployment rate, and specifically I'd look at the 3-month average of the U.S. national unemployment rate. Don't want to overreact to 1 month of data, and look at that 3-month average, the most recent, compare it to the low over the prior 12 months. 0.5 percentage point or more, the U.S. is in a recession. That had historically been the case, going back until almost with perfect accuracy historically, going back to the post-World War II period, and it turned on in when we got the employment numbers for July, and yet so that would say historically we would have been about 4 months into a recession. It's not a forecast; it's an indicator, and yet July of 2024. If you look at all the measures of the U.S. economy was not in a recession. Things were not contracting. We still have growth. Whether it's GDP or employment, they may have moderated some, but it doesn't look like a recession.
And the Atlanta GDP now estimates running at, is it almost 3% annualized for Q3? Am I right?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. No, we're on track to have Q3 on track potentially to be at 3%, and the quarter before is on record at 3%. Yeah, I mean, these are really good growth numbers. Now, this isn't to say the job gains have slowed considerably. The unemployment rate has risen. Some of that we had expected. This is where the normalization or the context of the last 4.5 years are so important, right? In that we had labor shortages, so the unemployment rate went really low in the U.S. And part of that was just we had millions of people drop out of the labor force because of the pandemic. And then customers came back really fast. So if I'm looking at changes in the unemployment rate, just that labor shortage dynamic, that the thing about COVID was not just some of the unusual patterns, they were huge. Some of these quote unquote supply side things. And I will say, to the Sahm Rule, just to with it, it wasn't up to the task. I consider it to have broken. It turned on, which normally says recession. You look around, it is highly unlikely, even after all the data revisions, that will say we're in a recession. But the Sahm Rule was a very simple, it in fact is would be considered a policy rule. I developed it as a signal of start fiscal policy in a recession. And clearly it was too simple for this moment. A lot of economic rules of thumb or guidance have been too simple. It got overwhelmed, in my opinion, by these changes in the labor supply, both the labor shortages, and then we've had a big wave of immigration, and just in general, people coming off the sidelines. So it's just that warning of, you have to dig a little deeper.
That's right. The reason I like it is, well, one of our problems is we're always dealing with a lagged picture of the economy. Reliable GDP data come out quarter over quarter, and they're often so heavily revised, whereas the labor force surveys, they come out a little bit more frequently, so we can recognize earlier. And I think it's interesting, your point, that in a way that the rise in the unemployment rate, I think we've seen it over here too. In a way, it's a normalization of labor demand, having been in a situation where firms had a strong preference for hiring in order to expand production at a time when risk-adjusted capital investment was well, it was highly risky, to say the least. And so if I understand the characterization of the Fed, the Fed has a strong economy. It sees growth well above potential, and I think the Fed thinks U.S. potential growth around 1.8, 1.9 to 3% is well above. You see this rise in the unemployment rate, and now it's time to react. But two things now strike me. The first is the Fed's reaction function seems to have adjusted slightly. It's moving to that second part of its mandate, which is maximum employment. and away from inflation, because inflation looks like it seems to be trending lower. But then also, is it right to say that the Fed has shifted slightly from being data dependent, that is somewhat backward looking at incoming inflation and price data, towards a more forward-looking view, which is actually, if we keep monetary policy as tight as it is, the risk is that we do suffer not just a slowdown in momentum, but an outright deterioration. And so that there are two changes there that the Fed has taken.
So I see this Fed and read their most recent actions as still being highly data dependent.
Okay.
The period between the July Federal Open Market Committee meeting and the September Federal Open Market Committee meeting, in those 7 weeks, we received an unusual amount of data about the U.S. labor market. We had 2 employment reports, which we get every month, and we also had a preliminary estimate of what will be the annual revisions to the job gains, and and then sundry other surveys that would come in and be part of it. But those 3 main pieces of labor market data were all pretty downbeat.
Do you think the Fed would have moved earlier if it had a choice? Do you think it would have, in hindsight, it would have preferred to go 25 basis points a couple of months earlier?
My interpretation, when Fed Chair Powell talks about a recalibration, which is a very Fed word, I was like, oh, I called that one. That's a great way to do it. In the press conference, he did make reference, not saying this was how the committee was thinking as a whole, but one way to think about it is they did discuss in July making their first quarter percentage point cut, and they chose not to. And I mean, not even 2 days later, the labor market data started coming in, and it was pretty downbeat. Then, you could think of this 50 in September, I think, as 225s put together. Yeah. And that's where I said the way they're presenting this still has a data wrapping to it, though. Yes, there is some of this risk, but it really does go back to the fact that inflation has made a lot of progress towards 2%. And they got more confirmation of that, and they've been waiting for it. They've been waiting for the data, and they kept getting it. So there would have been no cut without inflation having come down, right? So they've been at this. And then on top of that, not only did they learn that the labor market it's really moved past like a pre-pandemic pace. I mean, not necessarily that that's where we had to get back to, but I mean, the slowing that we've seen over the last few years, it really it goes past now normalizing or, getting cooling off. And they also got, with these revisions, a suggestion that the history, for over a year, they've been saying, well, we can wait on the inflation data because the labor market's so strong. And it's like, well, it wasn't quite as strong as you thought. So, and the Fed has a dual mandate. And that maximum employment mandate, that is not a no recession mandate, right? It's like the Fed, keep inflation low and keeps out of a recession. No, maximum employment means you keep employment as high as you can without creating inflation.
That's right. It's almost a maximum employment at tolerable levels of inflation. And I guess the fair assessment of the Fed is monetary policy is tight to some slightly unknown degree, and I think we'll come on in a second to discussions around what the neutral rate is. Now that we're almost at target for inflation, there's no good reason anymore, with evidence that the economy is slowing, for monetary policy to be tight. I think the danger for me would be, even though there's a good economic argument, I think, to go in large increments at the start and then perhaps slow down when you get close to what you think is neutral. The Fed, I think, has set quite a low bar for 50 basis point moves. The market has really reacted well, you could say, or not well, depending on how you look at it, to the 50 basis point move. And so I wonder if downside surprises to unemployment data at this stage almost force the Fed to keep going 50. But I mean, I suppose I'm really just asking the question here. Where do you think neutral is for the Fed, and what are you expecting for upcoming meetings in terms of Fed cuts?
So neutral in terms of that mythical federal funds rate level where the Fed isn't pushing up or down on the economy. It's going to evolve over time. I don't get into having a great deal of precision in it. I think at this point, knowing that the federal funds rate is now just a little bit under 5%, we probably have 2 percentage points before neutral. Now, in no way, shape, or form would I suggest go in and cut 200 basis points at a meeting just to kind of recalibrate, right? Like so there, but that underscores that there's some time. Even with the Fed has at least 100 basis points, if not 150 basis points of cuts to make that are kind of easy cuts in terms of where we likely are not sitting close to, really pushing up the economy. Now, there is a danger for the Fed if they move too slowly back to what could be some sense of neutral. It takes time for monetary policy to go into effect. It is not my base case of a recession, despite what the Sahm Rule is saying. Like, my base case is not a recession, particularly now that the Fed is moving with some purpose to get, because I think they are the recession, one of the big recession risks for the U.S. But I think they're moving in a way that that's not the case. And yet, if something were to happen, you have to, like, in a recession, you're not talking about 200 basis points. You're talking about more than that. Right, because you really would get below neutral to do support. So the Fed is at a pretty elevated, for them, not historically, but recent, in recent past, they're at a relatively high rate. And so this going slow, it comes with a cost, not just what it's doing maybe to the labor market right now, but also just that how long it takes if they needed to do some, faster, larger adjustments and support the economy. So, but it's, as I think Powell has his line, his rather clever little line that, is, we know our star by its works, right? You have to kind of see where the Fed is, what's happening in the economy. I think, that sounds great as a little fun way to talk about it, but we know how hard the economy is to read right now, and some of the areas of the economy that the Fed has historically had its most direct influence, like housing markets, are just like it's very clear that the rate cycle, very low then to the higher, has created disruptions in the housing market.
I think you can say that just broadly about monetary policy, that you see it by its effect. I mean, it's very difficult just from, say, the Fed funds rate alone just to judge whether monetary policy is tight, neutral, or easy. I'm just looking actually at the September projections, and for our listeners, the Fed is estimating change in real GDP at basically 2% over the next 4 years, which doesn't sound all that interesting, but if you then look at the range of estimates, I take a look at 2025, 1.3 to 2.5%. Even in 2027, 1.7 to 2.5, which actually is the range for the longer run estimates as well. Also, quite a large range on unemployment, 3.5 to 4.5% on the longer run, which is signaling a degree of uncertainty, assuming that the Fed gets its 2% target roughly on track. Uncertainty around the supply side of the US economy, which sort of brings us back to our early point. And actually, one remarkable observation, I think, in the US is, given the apparent tightness in the labor market, is just how well it seems to be sustaining growth at above the Fed's estimate of potential. And I'm sort of curious on your thoughts. I mean, do you think at this stage with AI, which is far in advance in the US of almost anywhere else in the developed world, whether we can say now we are observing a positive technology shock? Because this is usually the thing that resets monetary policy to the upside. We had something similar in the 90s. Of course, we've all been struggling for productivity growth over the past 20 years, but now suddenly it looks as if the US is growing at a sustainable rate that's not inflationary, that's well above what we had become used to in that post-Lehman era. So what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, to really work through the growth data and say something about long-term growth, the dust have not settled.
Okay.
It's really remarkable how strong GDP growth has been, particularly into 2024. I mean, actually, the whole time, like it's been really exceeded expectations. But in 2024 in particular, you've got some fairly, trend to above trend growth. I mean, 3%, well above what would be a kind of trend consensus estimates of trend growth in the U.S. And yet we have the unemployment rate is rising and job gains are so where this ends up almost mechanically in the way these, when we put all the statistics together, is that labor productivity growth has really taken off. Now, that would be amazing. Like, for as much as we talk about the Fed and the quarter point here and the this or that, like the holy grail of macroeconomics in terms of prosperity, and this is not just the US, I know the UK would feel similarly, is getting like just a tenth or two on the productivity, trend productivity, right? Because that just, that's the gift that keeps on giving. Now, it has... I have found it pretty remarkable in the Fed, in their summary of economic projections, doing their long run estimates. So they have revised up the median Fed official, is like revised up their neutral rate estimate almost a half a percentage point, not quite, like over the past year. And actually, for a long run estimate, that's a pretty big revision.
That's a huge revision. That's right.
And I mean, what they're really doing is looking at, we raised interest rates a whole bunch and the economy didn't tank. It's like this like revealing by the works is actually difficult because there's a lot of other things going on in the U.S. economy, not just the Fed moving interest rates. But you've seen this pretty notable. I still think it's a little bit south of 3% for the neutral rates. I think it's fine where it's at, but they haven't made they haven't made enough adjustments to actually shift the central tendency, to shift the median on the growth rates. So I think it's also this let's wait and see, is this real, this productivity, is it going to stick? In general with this cycle, as we said, there have been some very unusual dynamics that the pandemic kicked off, and they were big. And I think in many cases there were views of, this is the new normal, and it's like, how is this the new normal?
That's right.
And then it reverses. So it's like kind of trying to, and yet I do think, to your point, there are the automation, work from home, like not just in term, like it opened up some avenues for participation in work that hadn't been there for certain groups of workers in the U.S. So that flexibility in a labor market that was firing on all cylinders, I think, did a lot for the U.S. in the recovery. Now, we'll see what sticks.
U.S. exceptionalism is it at the moment it comes in many forms, but I would like to just conclude with your thoughts on fiscal policy in a moment. But I think when I look at the big difference between Europe and the U.S., certainly coming out of the pandemic through 2021. And again, if I just do a really headline analysis, nominal GDP in the US and the UK has been on a broadly similar trend. All of the difference is in real GDP. And our problem has been, we're a net importer of energy. We import 35% of our GDP. We don't have a proper reserve currency. In the US, you have a reserve currency, import around 15% of your GDP, a net exporter of energy. And so the supply shocks have distorted real performance in a much bigger way on this side of the Atlantic than they have in the US. And because of this unique, I think, ability to match domestic demand mostly with domestic supply, you have this fiscal advantage too, whereas if we were to stimulate through fiscal policy at this moment, even for investment, it would just be difficult to get the capital goods. It would be difficult to match that demand with supply, and suddenly it would be inflationary. And so I think maybe we could just get your thoughts on the role of U.S. fiscal policy, perhaps actually in raising supply. Maybe I'm thinking here a little bit about the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act. But when I look at markets, there just seems to be. I think I'm right. I think the U.S. deficit at the moment is probably running around 7% of GDP, which is a lot at full employment. But there's an implicit trust in, I think, in the bond market that this is mostly supply-oriented fiscal policy. There's some method to this. Yes, it probably does carry risks in case of a recession, but it's in a way it's utilizing the benefit of the dollar rather than being risky with these structural advantages. And so I'm setting up here. We have an election later this year on the 5th of November. Two very different policy platforms. Maybe you could just conclude with your thoughts on U.S. fiscal, the role it's been playing in lifting U.S. economic momentum, and what you think the outlook is after the upcoming election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I am a big proponent of this cycle, even looking back and understanding the fiscal response. The United States went big on fiscal. They went bigger than peer countries. I mean, that at the beginning of the Biden administration, there was yet another there was really a demand support fiscal package that was very controversial, but did push into the recovery. And absolutely, in this past administration, you've seen a whole host of more supply side, at least intended and packaged. The ability to do that and to do it well, the details matter, but you certainly saw a push for that. And I think that could be a very, very thin silver lining of this crisis, is understanding that there are supply disruptions that can come in, affect inflation, affect workers, and the Fed is not the one interest rates are not the tool to deal with that. So I think that has been an important shift. Now, in the United States for decades, there has been a very strong, the debt is unsustainable, we're on a path that is going to cause dislocation. You'll hear it from politicians, you'll hear it from markets, and yet nothing has happened in that regard, which is not to, that doesn't say that, there aren't issues. There certainly are issues with, particularly the way the entitlement budget is set up in the U.S. These costs will get larger and larger, but it is, in some ways, it feels like only a crisis will move the needle in terms of actually doing anything about the U.S. budget deficit. But the rhetoric will continue. With the upcoming election, one thing to remember with the United States is it's very important who sits in the White House. And yet, to get many of the policy priorities in place, it will depend who's sitting in Congress as well. And so that whole setup is really, there are lots of question marks about who that'll be. And the policies at this point are very much in their campaign form. So asking an economist, go in and do the details. I think that, Vice President Harris has gotten a lot of attention from, say, economists talking about price gouging and these different, and you can set up details and think about it in a way that, no, this makes a lot of sense. Companies shouldn't profit from a pandemic or a war in Ukraine, right? There were plenty of, not price control, but but there are other versions of it that would be really harmful and detrimental, right? And so but things are pitched to get votes, and I'm encouraged to hear fiscal policymakers engaging with the idea of that, there is some inflation that is their responsibility as well. I think the big picture areas that have been of concern have been around tariffs. Anything that affects inflation at this point is of concern. I think should be of consumers, but certainly to markets. That would affect the way the Fed thinks about some of the policies about mass deportation of immigrants would be just economically very problematic if you just stay on the economics. So there are, and no candidate has come out with a balanced budget proposal.
That's right.
Right. There are estimates that some of what former President Trump has put on the table would add more to the deficit. And that's less the case for Harris's, what's been proposed. And yet, again, neither are coming in with we're going to make the tough decisions to balance it. And frankly, there are investments that still need to be made. And I do support, I think, on the economics, continuing to make those investments. But it will be, the two candidates bring very different not totally different. They overlap on some policies, but some which are good, some which are bad. But it's really this piece of Congress and what can get done.
That's right. Yeah, I look at the polls and then they're not leaning strongly either way, which makes it difficult. And I from afar, this for markets is a kind of a event horizon risk. We just need to learn what kind of world we're in the day after, and then I think we can make some adjustments. Thank you so much for joining me. Perhaps you could let everyone know where they might be able to find you on Twitter or on Substack. And
yeah, so I have a Substack, Stay at Home Macro, play on my last name, Sahm. I write there. I am on Twitter at Claudia_Sahm, and also on LinkedIn. I'll post shorter pieces there as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That was a real pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.